Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Unlocking Venture Capital. I'm here with my friend Michaela Gordon from Wesley. How are you, Michaela?
Doing great. So excited to be here. Thanks
I
for
am
having me
so
today.
excited to have you. Oh my gosh. So, Michaela, you have worked on so many things. Not only did you have like a full-time job at a huge venture capital fund, but you also had so many side projects that really helped a lot of people getting into the industry. So, I know that you have a lot of amazing insights from a different perspective that I think other people just can't see. So, would love to like delve into, first, why did you start this newsletter? And why did you call it the early? And just kind of what it meant to you.
Yeah, it's a funny story. So, about a year into my job as an analyst at the Wesley Group, which is a $300 million venture capital firm, I basically realized, kind of being the youngest one at my firm, there weren't a ton of resources for early career, VCs.
Yeah.
And I'd actually been asked by a lot of, kind of juniors and seniors in college, do you know like any venture capital roles that are open? Obviously, it's a super network driven recruiting process, just getting into VC. And at the same time, I was getting sent a lot of open roles by other VCs I knew who were already in the industry. So I figured it would be helpful, for people who were recruiting if I put together this job board, which is initially how my newsletter started. It's called the Early VC Job Board. And I was just posting kind of open roles every week that I was getting into my inbox. And then that ultimately turned into me sending out the roles every week. And then that kind of snowballed into me writing more thought pieces to help kind of early career professionals and turn it into the early, which it is today. And I think the name is kind of self-explanatory. I probably could have picked something more creative, but that's where we're at today.
Oh my gosh. So I love that it's evolved to so many things. And it feels like, a lot is reflecting on the things that you've learned, the things that you've done as a venture capitalist as well. And so you're out in the Bay Area, which is, such a hot place to be finding lots of different kinds of opportunities there. In
Yes.
terms of your thought pieces, how did you feel when you kind of first came out with your very first article for your newsletter? How did that feel to really put that out there?
Yeah, it was honestly scary at first because I've been reading a lot of thought pieces by kind of established,
Yeah,
VCs who had
right.
invested in unicorns and had 20 years of experience. So I was a little intimidated to put my own thoughts out there. But then I realized, I'm writing for an audience that's going through the same thing I went through a year ago. And I thought that it actually gave me a different perspective being early in my career than, maybe someone who's more experienced and further away from the recruiting process.
Yeah.
So I put out the first article. I got a lot of positive feedback on it. Recently I've written articles about how to get into angel investing as a young professional when you don't have millions of dollars in capital to
Yeah.
throw around,
Yeah.
talking about what to do when you get that first VC job, tips for the recruiting process when you're, kind of deep into the interview stage. And I've gotten just positive feedback, even that short articles, linking other resources has been helpful because it's just such kind of a gate kept black box industry that I found like almost anything can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I kind of feel like it's like a double-edged sword. Like no matter how much stuff you put out there, it is still a black box. Somehow this box never seems to
Totally.
have light. And I don't really know
Totally.
why. I was like, it's such a new industry. Of course, it's gonna start off being very anonymous, very unknown in a lot of ways, because there were just very few leaders that started this industry. And people kind of come in and out in kind of very odd ways as well. So I know that you started this initiative about 2 years ago when the job market was booming, and now it is very, very different with high interest rates and lots of new funds trying to start. Some of them are getting off the ground, some of them are not. And so, what did you see then, and what do you see now as a general landscape from your perspective?
It's a great question. Totally spot on that when I was in the recruiting process, there were so many firms popping up and so
Yeah,
many openings for people who were right out of school or had that 2 years of whether it's banking experience, product, etc. A lot of firms were looking and open to hiring people with, less experience and no venture experience. Whereas now I think you see a lot of those firms kind of maturing, and we know that there are more firms than there are, suitable like potential unicorn investments. We see like new venture firms popping up pretty much every week. And it just seems like kind of bubble where
Yeah.
there aren't enough fund return investments
Yeah.
to support that. So I think with that, you're seeing firms be a little bit more picky when it comes to the experience they're looking for. Obviously, just the job market as a whole is incredibly difficult right now. So there are more applicants for every position. We posted a position at Wesley and we got tons of applications like within the first couple of days.
Yeah.
So I think you're just seeing this more competitive market
Yeah.
mixed with an already black box industry, which is creating an even more competitive hiring process.
And like, so I've seen a job posting that posted for 4 days, and then they got over 1,000 applicants, and they was taken down. And so then by the time and they posted about this too. It was not like a secret. And then so then like what happened was that when other people then reposted the jobs and things like that, it was actually a dead link. And it created this like on cycle of just frustration. And so I was wondering if that has happened to you, or if that's like feedback that people have given to you, being like, I don't know what this link is about. I don't know what this is about, or like this just general confusion about situations that were not exactly what they seem, and kind of how did you deal with that or filter that in a different way?
Yeah, and that's such a huge challenge in the VC recruiting process
Uh,
that a lot of these applications are rolling. So
yeah,
there's no set deadline like you would for an APM program or, a financial analyst program.
right.
And what I've tried to do with my newsletter is make sure that every job I post was released within a week or a week before I post them.
Yeah,
So I'm trying to post them as soon as possible, just because I know that these can close like within 3 days, and there's a lot of kind of opacity around the process. So I also write in my newsletter, as soon as you see a role you're interested in, try to get that application in as soon as possible,
yeah,
because you never know how long that role is going to be open. And a lot of processes are carried out, kind of internally, and then the roles are posted, but they might not be necessarily looking at all the applications after a certain point. So I try to recommend literally apply as soon as possible once you see a role.
yeah. I can't believe that like a week is considered long. Like like that's like a long. That's like a lifetime. One of the things that I learned when I first got into venture was that a minute is like a year to a VC, right? And so the time or
100%.
the perspective of time is very different. And so there were a lot of these little like nuances about this world that was so different from when I used to work in corporate. And I was wondering if there were these kind of nuances that you have, learned at yourself as a VC that are not spoken and are not written about. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess that was a thing. Sure, I'll do that. And like, yeah, that was like a good lesson. But it was also kind of like, yeah, nobody would ever write about it. That's just something you're supposed to know. And I'm like,
Right.
I don't know how I'm supposed to know this.
Totally. Yeah. Like you're supposed to there's this unspoken thing. You're supposed to socialize a lot and go
Yes,
to these events. And
yes.
it's not necessarily part of your job description, but
That
your
interesting.
role, especially when you're at an earlier stage, is find as many good companies as possible. And, you kind of get hired to a VC firm and then you just get told, go. Like find these incredible companies, and you're left kind of to your own devices to figure out how to do that. And I think everyone has a slightly different approach, and it depends on, what communities you're already part of, where you're living, like people in other industries. So it's just so hard to follow like one path in this industry. And I think that's something that is really unique about venture.
Yeah, that is so interesting too. And so like one thing that I noticed was so a friend of mine in New York, his fund closed, and he came and still went to the VC events. And so he still came to the VC events. And what was so interesting was like, so he was also a junior associate, and his fund closed. And then he goes, yeah, so, my fund just closed and I'm like looking for a new fund right now. And I just realized, I was like, because of what you said, people's schedules are that work really long hours, and then they're expected to go to these different events and expected to do these things to find new deal flow, to find lots of companies, lots of partnerships. He didn't know anyone else because he moved there for that job. He literally knew nobody else outside of the industry. And that was like his first job outside of school and everything. And I commend him for being so resilient, so brave, so courageous to show up and to be like, no, this is still my world. These are still my friends. And that's not something that I think anybody can just do, because it's really hard to face a lot of these kinds of life events. And so, yeah, we just would love to understand, your take about how it really is like another world that you've stepped into. You're not building a different life around this world in a different way, in especially these earlier years.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's another, I mean, you hit it spot on. That's another big differentiator from other roles, is that when you close the door on a VC role, you still have all these relationships with, the other investors that you have quarterly meetings with, and founders who you've been talking to, just because the feedback loop in venture is so long, and the relationships you build are real relationships. It's not just something that you have because of your role. So I think that's actually one of the cool things about being in the industry, is that even if you switch firms or you decide to go do something else for a little bit, you still know everybody who you met, and have these amazing friendships that you've built during your time in the industry. And being in venture, I think, gives you kind of an excuse to reach out to anyone, whether it's someone who's VC or founder, or just someone who's working on something cool. And I think that's something that you can definitely take with you. And I totally agree. I think it's amazing what your friend did, just to continue building those relationships after. And you don't need the VC title to keep reaching out to people and being proactive. So yeah, I think it's unique in that when you close, one role, you're not closing those relationships forever. And it's not something where you hand in your laptop and all of a sudden you're not in the VC ecosystem anymore. Like, it kind of carries with you for the rest of your career.
Isn't that so interesting? Like it's so like, because that's not the same at like any other job that I think I've ever had, and I think that goes the same for other people who had another life and then went into venture capital.
Yep.
And yeah, so in terms of you had this great perspective on what things looked like before and where things were going, and saw thousands of different kinds of startups. So if you were to pick different industries or startups or initiatives, what kind of problems do you think are worth solving, that are so interesting to you, and what direction do you kind of see things going in terms of trends and timeline?
So one of the kind of overarching themes that I was looking into really heavily was, what are antiquated industries that kind of haven't been touched by innovation in the same way a lot of, software industries, like
Yeah.
fintech, consumer companies, a lot of them are, really ripe with new technologies, and have been for the last 10 years. So one of my goals with a lot of the research that I've been doing is finding those industries that are kind of untapped.
Mhm.
And just to give an example, so there's been a lot of emphasis on, software design, so web design, writing better code, finding bugs. There hasn't been the same emphasis placed on hardware design in
Yes.
the last decade or two.
Yeah.
And if you look at the software that's being used to design hardware, it's Cadence, Altium, which are companies that have been around for decades and decades, and they're still being used today to design chips, to design PCBs, so the circuit boards that go into electronic devices, to design parts. And I think that's just an example of, it's a huge industry. There's hardware everywhere, but the
Yeah.
way it's being designed hasn't changed. So that's just an example of, maybe there's a gap here. And when I was doing a lot of research, I actually worked on a piece that was kind of highlighting all the startups that were in the space and looking to make a dent and kind of overhaul the design process. An example is Flux AI, which is doing automated circuit board design. There are also companies like Allspice, which are doing kind of repositories for hardware design and optimizing workflow. So just a really interesting space. And I think it kind of is an example of what I was saying of, disrupting antiquated industries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, coming from your role, you have seen a lot of what has worked and what hasn't worked, and the kinds of questions that people are asking to kind of see like, will this blow up really, really big, or is it going to be, a nice small business that is still going to do really well and to still be able to disrupt industries? Because I think that's one of the things that especially new founders kind of have a tough time seeing that difference. And it is a fine line sometimes because you are so branded with what you've built. It's so different when it's kind of your own company. And yeah, and you touched on this other trend that I've also seen, especially with people in that 1 to 2 or 3 year mark in their careers, and they go, I want to invest, and build wealth, and I want to invest in different things other than the things that my fund has invested in. I want to invest in either other funds or other companies. And so that whole thing is like a whole other journey. I know that some funds, especially emerging funds, are creating programs to teach first time LPs, including younger LPs, how to kind of get in there. And I think that that is so interesting to see that kind of interconnectivity. So what are you seeing in terms of these kinds of waves to stay in venture, be involved, but also for people who are very new and want to invest in the things that they really want to invest in, regardless of their fund's thesis or things like that, or maybe it's just not investable for VC, but it is investable for individuals.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important topic to talk about because there's one component of your career, which is what you're doing, 9 to 5, day to day, like your role. And then there's the other component, like you mentioned, which is, building your own personal wealth and making sure that you're set up for the future.
Yeah.
And they can be totally different in terms of themes. So at the Wesley Group, investing in clean tech companies that are maybe going to be market ready a decade from now or 7 years from now.
Yes, right.
And then there's also the angel investing side, which I mentioned an article I wrote about breaking into angel investing early in your career. And when it comes to that, I'm much more comfortable investing in like consumer products and software because they're more immediately commercially viable, and also things that I use as
Yeah.
opposed to, maybe like hydrogen or hardware for clean tech. So it's totally different what I'm drawn to in terms of those different aspects of my life. I would say angel investing, just one thing that I wanted to kind of convey in the article I wrote was you don't have to be a millionaire to break into angel investing. You can
Sure.
start as small as $1,000 checks, like
Yeah.
5K checks, and kind of build up from there. And
Yeah.
I think it's great to start like flexing that muscle and building that angel network early in your career. I would also say, also writing is another way that you can kind of share your thoughts on different industries, even if you're like transitioning out of the VC role or trying to break in. Other like more experienced investors have told me that they've read my research that I put out on like hardware design. Also wrote about the learning and upskilling market, and there were partners at firms who reached out to me because of it. So if you have something unique to add, I think you should always share it and not be intimidated by the fact that you're early in your career.
That is so great and very inspiring. I really love that, taking kind of that control back in your own hands and doing things that you really believe in, and knowing that it's not as intimidating as you think it would be, or the barriers are not as high as you think that it would be. That is really interesting. And it's true. There are a lot of opportunities that, first, all the opportunities are negotiable. That's how VC works anyway. So that's how angels should also work. And so, it is a lot of what you bring to the table is also what the input is, because you can't always really control the output, usually can't, but you can control how you're inputting, how you are investing in at the very early stage, at the very beginning. And that's really all you have. You can't really control what's going to happen in the future because you don't know what the market's really going to be. It's not your market anyway. And yeah, and so I think that that's really great. And I do also think, like, I'm wondering if that is a part of how nowadays, because jobs are so strange as they are. Before, like, you graduate, you have a corporate job, you're done, you're good. Okay, you just do that, and then after work, you do whatever you want. But it's kind of like now you have to have multiple streams of revenue, multiple streams of income to really build that wealth. And there are a lot of people that are gapped. So there are a lot of VC jobs that are not actually full time. And they only give you they only give you carry, or they only give you commission, or they only give you part-time, or whatever the case is, or contracts, right? And so you are in the industry, but you are also doing so many different kinds of things. So angel investment is a really great way to continue to kind of expand your own portfolio there.
100%. And I think there's this myth that you have to be super rich or you have to be an accredited investor, which means you have a net worth of over $1 million,
Yes.
which, 99.9% of people who are early in their career obviously do not, or you have to have an income of over $200,000 for 2 years in a row, which if this is your first full-time job, that won't be the case for you.
Yeah.
And I think it's not talked about a lot that there are startups that raise community rounds. So there's this platform called WeFunder that allows startups to publicly list their fundraising round, and they can check an option where you, as a non-accredited investor, join an SPV made up of other investors, and through that, you're able to invest even if you're unaccredited. So it's finding these kind of little openings in the market, finding kind of creative ways to still participate that I think are really important, just to shed a bigger light on, because I didn't know that you can make angel investments if you're not accredited until this past year. So I think talking about those things is really important.
Yeah, I absolutely. I don't think that that's a known thing either, because people keep using the phrase accredited investor as well. And so you think that that's the only path, for sure. Speaking of things that are not talked about, what kind of things do you think need to be talked about more that would be helpful to people that are generally not talked about, just like SPVs, just like angel investment, and just like how people are getting in with, depending on which year you got into the industry?
It's a great question. I would say how people are actually selected for jobs is something that isn't known when you're in the recruiting process. So when I was talking to VC firms and deciding on my first role, I thought it was, I had to have these financial modeling skills. I had to have, product experience or experience, running my own startup, whatever it was. And it turns out, at least from the firms I've talked to, the number one thing they look for is sourcing and being able to put that firm in front of companies that they wouldn't see otherwise, just because there are so many candidates who have the financial skills. There are a lot who have, that operating experience. And the thing that these firms don't have is access to the best companies. And that's ultimately what makes or breaks you as a firm. So I think that's something that I didn't understand at first. I would also say once you get into the role, a lot of analysts who I talk to don't realize how self-directed it is. Like, it's not a structured role at all. Maybe if you're joining a larger firm, like maybe an Insight or something that has a set associate program, you have a little more of it. But most analyst roles, you're the only early career member on the team, and you basically get given a mandate. This is our investment thesis. These are the stages we look at. Now go find the best companies. Mm-hmm. And that's not talked about a lot.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's very true. The way that they do the check marks is very different from, I think, other companies and other industries too. It's very different, because because it's hard to be like, how are you going to find the best companies? Well, first, you don't even know if they're the best companies, because you don't know anything about the fund yet. You didn't go there yet, and then you also don't know if these companies that you've met will necessarily get to Series A, B, C, D, or anywhere, right? So that's also really difficult to kind of put on that other side of the table. So it's so interesting that you bring that up. I've also been asked like a lot very recently why I wanted to be in venture. And so I knew that there was an epiphany moment actually when I was where you are now in the Bay Area, where I fell in love with this industry and I was with really like-minded people. And I knew that moment where I get to work with founders, and the moments where I get to invest in these great founders and help them get from point A to point B and help them go towards that scaling, that feeling tells me that I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to do in my life. And Michaela, I am so happy for you, because you got to have that feeling twice in your life. Being a professional athlete and doing this, it's something that I think most people search their entire lives for and may never get to find, or due to circumstances they never got to choose. And so would love to kind of see how you feel about being so lucky, because you see your job as like a unicorn hunter, but I see you as someone who is the unicorn itself.
Aw, thanks. That's very kind words. And I definitely don't view myself that way. So I appreciate that. I would say my journey in tennis, which I played from the age of 3 all the way through college and even now, was a lot different than finding my passion for investing in venture capital. So tennis was all I knew going into college. I was homeschooled in high school so that I could travel the world and play a global tennis schedule. I ended up playing junior Wimbledon and all of the junior Grand Slams, and playing a lot of professional tournaments that there were players, ranked in the top 20 in the world that were also playing. And it was kind of a path that had been set out for me and that had been chosen, or that I should say I chose, but from a very early age. Whereas venture capital was something I discovered late in my college experience, and I didn't really understand what it was. And I had this light bulb moment similar to you, where I was talking to founders during a VC internship I was doing. And I realized when I was talking to these amazing founders, the startups that they were working on were their life dreams, and they were really building their dreams through, these new technologies they were building or through this new consumer product that they were putting out. And it seemed like a dream job to be a partner to people who were building their dreams. And it made venture capital kind of a no-brainer. When I was coming out of college, I was deciding between taking an APM position or going into VC, and ultimately chose that because I thought, how unique of an opportunity is that to be able to be part of this journey for founders? So I would say it was a different journey between tennis and VC, but both gave me that intangible kind of energy that you talked about.
I love that. And I also love the initiative and the energy and the greatness that you keep putting out. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for sharing that on this episode. And thank you, everyone, for coming on to another episode of Unlocking Venture Capital. I'm here with Michaela Gordon.
Thanks, Sydney. This is super fun.